Not so long ago, in a world full of strife, a man born a wolf, living a dual life. With magic in his veins, he walked the school hall, learning the arts, answering the call. But fear was a cloak he had to wear tight, hiding his truth, keeping darkness from light. Those who were scared turned away in despair, yet he bore the burden, he chose to take care. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from magic, but his stories still flare, with tales of heroes, of legends so grand, selling dreams of the past across this vast land. In the shadows he lingered, where darkness would creep, protecting those kindly, never losing sleep. A guardian of secrets, a keeper of lore, he wandered through echoes, hearts wanting much more. No longer the wolf, but a sage with a pen, turning back the pages, reliving back then. His stories weave magic in the minds of the young, of battles and triumphs, where songs will be sung. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from magic, but his stories still flare, with tales of heroes, of legends so grand, selling dreams of the past across this vast land. Listen closely, hear the whispers in the breeze, of knights and of dragons beneath the ancient trees. The wolf in his wisdom has so much to share, from magic to courage, loving hearts laid bare. So gather round, children, let the stories unfold, of a man who had magic, but chose to be bold. Through tales of old, his spirit survives, a wolf in disguise, in every heart he thrives. Now the times have changed, the monster's no longer scared. He's retired from magic, but his stories still flare, with tales of heroes, of legends so grand, selling dreams of the past across this vast land. So remember this lesson as you look to the skies, even hidden beneath, we see with our hearts, not our eyes. For every wolf's journey, there's magic in the tales of kindness and courage, where love prevails. Not so long.
I really need to find out how to put the mute controller in my little controller. But hi. Okay. Now the ads are supposedly officially over. And it looks like my captions are working again. So that's improvement. So, it's Thursday, and that means it's time to read the 200-year-old book. Luckily the copy I have isn't that old. In fact, my copy's more recent printing. If I had a 200-year-old book, I'd probably not openly use it for stream, because that would be a little bit risky. But it makes me understand why in previous printings, including the original, they did it in volumes. Because I may be holding maybe a 6x8 book, but it's also fairly small print. It still ends up being like 300 and some odd pages. 400 and some odd pages. This book is last page of the actual story where it says the end is page 407. And yes, it actually ends with the end. Not many books do that. Anyway, I hope everyone's had a good week so far. Hey, Papa Penguin. I forgot I turned off the auto shadows. Ah, yeah. That is not what I did. I missed the V. Oh, heading to bed? Okay, well. Hopefully you have a good night's sleep. No? Still wanted to turn the shadow out. Oh, I did the shadow because you were lurking. Thank you for coming by. I did not change. Yeah, at least try. From what I understand, it's hard for parents to sleep. Can't imagine why. Okay, get these messages changed over. Last one. There we go. But thank you for coming in. Thank you for the alert. And there go my pens. Okay, my captions are a little odd. Yeah, we are reading this book, The Mummy, a tale of the 22nd century, which so far has been mostly political intrigue with a mummy. So, last week in the final chapter, finally got back to the people who started the whole thing, and they got caught in a storm while trying to cross the Mediterranean to get back to England. Well, they're still in the Mediterranean when the shipwreck happened, but they got washed ashore, and that's where chapter 19 left off. So that means that we are going to start with chapter 22. Yeah, I'm already messing up. Chapter 20. Try this one more time for posterity. Chapter 20. It was morning, and the glowing sunbeams danced gaily on the sparkling waters of the dark blue deep, as, gently ripping, it laved the rocky shore on which Edric and his tutor had been thrown, and seemed to smile, as if in mockery of the mischiefs it had wrought. There, sheltered by a rock whose jutting crag had saved them from being carried back to the devouring ocean, lay our travelers, apparently buried in sleep, returning consciousness not having yet dispelled the torpor provided. I am just messing up. There, sheltered by a rock whose jutting crag had saved them from being carried back into the devouring ocean, They are travelers, apparently buried in deeps, returning conscious. Man, small print. They are travelers, apparently buried in sleep, returning consciousness, not yet having dispelled the torpor produced by the fearful terrors of the night. The sun now shone brightly, and its glowing heat revived Edric from his trance. Slowly and heavily he unclogged his languid eyes, and, forgetting where he was, attempted to rise. He succeeded, but weak and dizzy, he only staggered a few paces ere he fell again, and roaring of the ocean still sounded in his ears. His senses swam, and giddy and enfeebled by his previous exhaustion, he fancied himself still tossed upon the foaming billows. For some time he lay in a state of torture, the thrill of returning circulation tingling through his vein, till the recollection of what had passed flashing across his mind, he again endeavored to rouse himself and to seek his tutor. The unfortunate doctor, however, appeared to be no more, and as Edric gazed upon this inanimate form, he might have exclaimed with Prince Henry, "I could have been a better spared, a better man. I could have better spared a better man." Okay. At this moment, Edric recollected the strong chemical preparations the doctor generally carried with him, and searching his pockets, he found a potent elixir. With some difficulty he forced a few drops down his throat, and taking a dose also himself. The effects of the medicine were soon visible. The doctor heaved a deep sigh, and opening his eyes, gazed vacantly around, whilst Edric himself felt perfectly restored. "Where am I?" cried Dr. Entwerfen, as soon as he was sufficiently recovered to speak. And then, as some of the horrors he had so lately witnessed recurred to his mind, he exclaimed, "I will never disclose it! No torture shall compel me! Where is the justice? He fled away in the flame of fire, hanging in the devil's horn! Ah, Edric, where are we? Ah, I have had such a horrid dream." "Alas," returned Eric, "it is but too real." "What? What?" cried the doctor, getting up and staring wildly around him. "I remember now. We were drowned. But where are we now?" "I know not," replied his pupil mournfully. "You forget I have been exposed to the same perils as yourself, and that I am equally ignorant where fate has thrown us. I should think, however, from the position where we were when the storm began, that we are somewhere on the shores of the Mediterranean, but whether Europe or Africa, I have as yet no means of ascertaining." "We must explore," said the doctor solemnly. "We ought not to remain in doubt another instant upon our important subject. Follow me." They now quitted the rocky beach on which they had so long lain, and advanced towards some cliffs which shut them out from the view of the surrounding country. When they had surmounted this natural barrier, they found the prospect that presented itself superb, and their wandering eyes with delight over orange groves and forests of cork trees, whilst the green shining leaves and the rich scarlet blossoms of the pomegranates, and the light tender waving foliage of the olive afforded a variety to the scene. The burning heat of the sun's rays felt softened by the breezes from the sea. A balmy fragrance seemed to pervade the air. Birds flew twittering around them, or perched on branches of the trees, made of the groves resound from melodious harmony, whilst butterflies of the most brilliant colors fluttered from flower to flower, and innumerable buzzing insects seemed to fill the air with motion. "What a lovely country!" said the doctor, as he and Edric penetrated into the deep recesses of a shady grove. "And how delightful this is a sensation of refreshing coolness, after having been exposed to the burning rays of the sun! And yet it is early, and for the sun has not yet reached far above the horizon, and the dewdrops still glisten in the rays like diamonds hanging on every leaf. Where can we be? Surely we are not dead, and now in paradise." Edric smiled. "I rather think," said he, "that we're in Andalusia. I have often read of the exquisite beauty of some of the southern provinces of Spain, and this seems well to accord with the ideas I have always entertained of that country." They now approached what appeared to be a cemetery, which was tastefully adorned with weeping willows hanging over the graves, whilst roses and thousand beautiful flowering shrubs, flourishing in the wild luxuriance from the genial nature of the climate, spread around and gave this receptacle mouldering remains of mortality the aspect of a blooming garden. "How different from the pyramids!" exclaimed the doctor and Edric at the same moment. "The tombstones seem to have inscriptions upon them," continued the former, after a short pause. "Let us approach and examine them. They will at least declare which country we are in by the language in which they may be written." The idea struck Edric as feasible, and they entered the cemetery. "You're right, Edric," said the doctor. "We are in Spain, for here lies the mortal remains of Don Alfonso, the mighty hero from the Bourbon race, who, you doubtless remember, was the first that conquered the northern part of Africa and transferred the seat of the Spanish Empire to Fez. Contributed so powerfully to the civilization and conversion of the Christianity for all that vast country." Congrats on getting second, Matsu. "And who also destroyed Spain as a monarchy by doing so," added Edric. "It is true," replied the doctor, "that Spain, finding itself too mighty for a providence, shook off its consequence of the yoke and its descendants and erected its present republic, which it most probably would never have done if the seat of government had remained at Madrid. But that is a trifling compared to the inestimable benefits produced to the world at large by the civilization and reduction to a Christian state of such a mighty empire as that of Morocco. Had it not been for that, we might still be remained in degrading ignorance in which mankind were immersed for so many centuries respecting the interior of Africa. Timbuktu would never have risen to its present eminence in science and commerce, and the real course of the Niger would still have been discovered. The sources of the Nile still remain wrapped in oblivion. Yes, mighty shade, thou wert a hero. Calamity may assail thy fame, and enlightened minds cavil at the wonders of thy glory, but one firm and attached votary still remains to thee, and thus he humbly bends to do thee homage." An unidentified ghost appears. Catch it using Poke Catch. It'd be funny if it was a mummy. Or, I can't remember what Pokemon it is. So saying, the doctor prostrated himself upon the tomb, and reverently kissed the cold marble inscribed with the hero's name. "Hold! Hold!" cried a man, rushing from behind a small temple and seizing him, whilst in an instant Edric and his tutor found themselves surrounded by soldiers, whose grim visages spoke them injured to blood and warfare. "Wretch!" exclaimed the leader, apostrophizing the terrified doctor, "but thy life shall be soon paid a forfeit for thy crimes. Away with him!" continued he, addressing his soldiers. "Bear him before the next alcalde, and let him there suffer the punishment of the law enacts against those who dare to praise the actions of worship of the memory of the tyrannic Alfonso. Away with him, I say!" "Mercy! Mercy!" implored the doctor. "Impossible!" said the leader sternly. "Do you not know that this is a land of liberty, and that we abhor the very name of tyranny and oppression? How then can the admirer of a tyrant hope for mercy at our hands? Away with him, I say, and with his companion too, for they appear to be associates. No doubt their principles are the same." "And do you call this a land of liberty?" asked Edric reproachfully. "Hear him! He blasphemes!" cried the soldier. "Gag him if he dared again to breathe such impiety!" And amidst their shouts and execrations, Edric and his tutor were dragged away. Taught by this lesson that the liberty of the Republican Spaniards did not extend to the tolerance of any opinions except their own, Edric and the doctor did again venture to speak, and soon, to their infinite dismay, found themselves in the presence of the alcalde, who, however, luckily for our travelers, happened to be a man of some sense and liberality. He smiled when he heard the substance of the facts gravely stated against the prisoners. "This case requires a private hearing," he said. "Velasquez, conduct the prisoners to my own apartment." We will have no private hearing, clamored the people in this orders. The crime was public, and the punishment should be too. We will not be gulled. But, gentlemen, said the magistrate, supposing these prisoners to be part of a gang of conspirators who have been plotting against the state, and it might defeat the ends of justice to have them examined publicly, and if possible, mind, gentlemen, I say, only if possible, if the traitors may lurk among the crowd before me, who might give intelligence to the other parties interested, who might thus enable to make their escape. "Aye, now you speak reason," said the mob. "We're always willing to listen to reason." And without further remonstrance, they permitted the alcalde and the prisoners to retire. "You see, gentlemen," said the alcalde, shutting the door to the room carefully, and placing the chairs in which he invited his prisoners to sit down, "that all is not liberty which is called so, and that the mob can occasionally be as tyrannical as an emperor. I know that in reality there is not a shadow of complaining against you, yet I dare not release you, as my own life would be forfeit if I did. You must thus submit to a temporary restraint, which you may rest assured I shall only endeavor to shorten, but shall render as light as possible whilst I am compelled to inflict it." "My dear sir," said the doctor, "we are exceedingly obliged by your kindness. If we had not met with you, I do not know what would have become of us. I could not have believed the people in the existence of so illiberal as these Spaniards, or that any human being would be so weak to fancy themselves in a land of liberty whilst they are practicing the most refined tyranny." "And yet my countrymen are neither fools nor hypocrites," returned the alcalde, "but, like many other people, they deceive themselves, and talk about freedom till they fancy they possess it. Their great fault, however, has been that they did not know where to stop, and as even virtue becomes vice when carried to the extreme, so have the most sublime principles of liberty and patriotism become degraded in their hands, by being attempted to be carried to an exaggerated degree of perfection." "Oh, England, England!" sighed the doctor. "Would to heaven I had never left thy happy shores! Alas, alas, what a crowd of horrible events have occupied the last few months!" "Why did you leave your country, since you so bitterly regret it?" demanded the alcalde. "Because we could not be contented," replied Edric. "Devoted from my earliest youth to the pursuits of science, I craved ardent for knowledge denied to mortals. I aspired to penetrate into the profoundest secrets of nature, and burnt to accomplish wishes destined never to be realized. The desire of seeing foreign countries also filled my soul. I longed to travel, and to acquire new ideas and meet with strange and wonderful adventures. I sickened of the quiet and tranquillity of "Give me change," cried in badness. "Give me variety," I asked no more. Even for the wretchedness itself were better to bear than this tiresome, unvarying uniformity. The unreasonableness of my wishes deserved punishment, and I have been cursed with the very fulfillment of my wishes. "Is this gentleman also a votary of science?" asked the alcalde, who had appeared musing whilst Edric spoke.
"What a question!"
exclaimed the doctor, in a transport of indignation.
"What! Has my whole life been devoted to scientific pursuits? Have I deprived myself of rest and almost of food, and wasted the midnight lamp in bringing to perfection some of the most sublime discoveries ever vouchsafed by man to the insulted? To be insulted suited with such a doubt as that? Now, sir, that you see before you Dr. Entwerfen, the fortunate adventurer of the immortalizing snuff, one pinch cures all diseases by smell, the discoverer of the capability of cartouche being applied to aerial purposes, and the maker of the most tremendous and powerful galvanic battery ever yet beheld by mortal."
"Then you are the very man I want," said the alcalde. "Go to prison contentedly, and rest satisfied that your confinement will be of very short duration. In a day or two I will see you, and explain the project I have conceived for your deliverance." So saying, he summoned his guards, and ordering them to convey the travelers to prison, the doctor and Edric were dragged away, and being immured in separate dungeons, were left there to ruminate upon the varied and busy scenes in which they had been so lately engaged. Sadly and heavily passed the time, yet days and weeks rolled on ere they saw the alcalde. At length, when they had just begun to despair, they were reconducted to his presence. "Do you understand the management of an electrical machine?" asked he abruptly.
Certainly,
cried the doctor, transported with joy at the question, for Edric, who was half blinded by the sudden change from his gloomy prison to the broad light of day, had sufficiently recovered himself to reply. "Then it is within your own power to free yourselves," continued the alcalde. "The principal general of the army stationed here is ill. A powerful party exists against him who wish his death, at the head of whom stands the leader who was the cause of your being taken into custody. The general himself is mere nonentity, but the opposite party, to which I belong, wish to save his life, and his name affords a sanction under which they can act. He is now ill of a palsy, and has been recommended to try the effects of an electric shock. A machine has been with difficulty procured in the remote district, but the philosopher of the army being lately dead, and another not having yet been appointed, no one here knows how to apply it. Now if you—"
"Say no more,"
said the doctor, interrupting him, in a transport of delight.
"Say no more, I see. I comprehend the whole. I shall restore him, and receive my liberty as a reward. Nay, more. I shall obtain immortality amongst the Spaniards for my deed. Their poets will sing of my fame, and the historians will pause upon the fact."
"You will undertake it, then?" said the alcalde, and reading the indignant affirmation in the doctor's looks, he led the way to the camp, a short distance from the village, where a paralytic general was sitting in a kind of throne, placed without his tent, and surrounded by
I like
principal
pouncing.
officers. Hey, Oni. You've got some getting started. And thank you for that, Drake. He led the way to a camp, at a short distance from the village, where the paralytic general was sitting in a kind of throne, placed without his tent, and surrounded by the principal officers of his staff, the electrical machine, a large, clumsy, heavy-looking thing standing before him. The doctor looked with dismay at this unwieldy apparatus, so different from his own neat, powerful compendium of science, as he was wont to call it, and saw the infinite horror that even its construction was totally different from those he had been accustomed to. His natural vanity and presumption, however, revolted from making this mortifying acknowledgment, particularly after the boasts he had been indulging in to the alcalde, and relying upon his general knowledge of principles of science, he walked boldly up to the machine, with as much composure and self-confidence as though he had been accustomed to the management of it all his life. The considerable trepidation, however, crept over him as he examined and found its movement intricate and complicated to the extreme, and his hands trembled, and a thick film came over his eyes as he attempted to charge and to adjust the cylinder. No time, however, was allowed for deliberation. He was ordered to apply it instantly, and terrified by the recollection of the prompt manner in which the Spaniards were accustomed to make themselves obeyed, and the already long and severe imprisonment he had undergone. He set in motion an unlucky wire, however, which he did not quite understand, and pointed upwards. Then he tried in vain to arrange it. Again he tried, but instantly fell to the ground by a tremendous shock, whilst a loud crash of thunder burst with violence over his head, and a vivid flash of lightning proclaimed that the ill-managed machine had drawn down the electric fluid from the heavy cloud that happened unfortunately to be just above them, upon the head of the unfortunate general, whom it scorched to a cinder, leveling some of the officers to the earth, and scattering the rest in all directions. For a moment the doctor himself was blinded by the sudden light, and when he recovered his sight, the first thing that met his eyes was his friend the alcalde sticking fast by the skirts of his coat on a hedge. Terrified at the mischief he had done, the first impulse of the learned doctor was to run away, but, notwithstanding the general confusion and dismay, the first imitation he showed of his design drew round him a crowd of soldiers. like peanuts, like peasants around a mad dog, who seemed to think of him as little entitled to mercy as he had really been one of the unfortunate animals. "Cut him down!" cried one. "Blow his brains out!" shouted another. "Chop off his head!" screamed the third, and summary punishment would have instantly have been inflicted if the alcalde, who in the meantime had contrived to extricate himself from the uncomfortable situation and had not interfered. "Villain!" cried he, as soon as he had recovered his breath, for being rather fat he found himself applying exercise too violently to suit his taste. "Is this the manner in which you treat me? Was it for this I brought you to the camp and would have made your fortune? Wretch that you are, hanging too good for you, and pawing live mercy is what you deserve. Away with him to prison. He merits not death, so easy a way would give him. Carry him back to his dungeon, and let him there wait punishment the council may judge fit for killing a general and frightening an alcalde out of his senses." "Mercy! Mercy!" screamed the doctor, but his cries were disregarded, and he and Edric were dragged back to the prison, deprived of every hope of obtaining forgiveness. Sadly and silently passed the hours of his gloomy abode, for the doctor and his pupil were now admitted to be together. Little communication took place between them, as though Edric was too good-natured to upbraid his unfortunate companion, yet it was past the power of human nature not to feel enraged at the folly that had drawn them into this disagreeable situation. The poor doctor, however, needed not to be upbraided, for he had reproached his own conscience were more bitter than any Edric could have lavished upon him. "I am lost!" cried he, "ruined and utterly undone! Not only my body will perish miserably, but my fame, my immortal fame, is destroyed. Oh, I shall go detracted!" In this manner he lamented, wringing his hands and tearing his hair, whilst Edric felt too angry to attempt to console him. "Speak to me, Edric, dear!" cried the poor doctor at last, quite in despair at the silence. "For heaven's sake, speak to me! Do let me hear the sound of some voice besides my own, and that of the cursed Spaniards! Oh, Edric, Edric, solitary confinement is quite enough to drive a man distracted, but to have a companion in such a place as this, and he refuse to speak! Oh, Edric, Edric, your heart must be turned to stone if you can resolve to use me so cruelly!" Edric was moved by the doctor's sorrow. "What do you wish me to say?" asked he, smiling. "Oh, now that's like yourself!" cried the poor doctor, bursting into tears and throwing his arms round Edric's neck, whilst he sobbed upon his shoulder like a child. "Now I shall die happy! I don't care what they do to me! I'm quite ready for anything that may happen!" Edric was affected by the doctor's manner, and returning his embrace warmly, he could not restrain his own tears. "Oh, my dear, dear Edric!" cried the doctor. "How I love you! Would to heaven I could save you! I would not care for myself." "And I would not accept the liberty without you, my dear tutor, I assure you," returned Edric. "No, no, the perils we have undergone together have added new force to the ties that formerly united us, and our fate now, be it good or ill, shall be the same. It is possible, however, that there may also be some means of escape." "Alas, no!" said the doctor mournfully, seeing Edric look around at the walls and windows. "This is the same dungeon I have been so long confined in, and not even a mouse could get out of it without the keeper's permission." "What is to be done, then?" cried Edric. "Aye," replied the doctor, "what indeed? However, it is certainly a great comfort to have a companion in one's misery, and though my prospects are certainly not much improved since you joined me, my cares are lessened at least one half." "Oh, my poor father!" cried Edric. "The hardest part of my fate seems to die without obtaining his forgiveness. Alas, if he could only see me now, he would surely repent his ill-timely severity. Fain would I also have passed in England since we left. If Edmund be married, and if Claudia still reigns. It is spring when we left England, it is now winter. Alas, alas, how many changes in a brief space of time may have been produced! If, however, my father's life has been spared, I care not for the rest." "How little do we anticipate," said the doctor, "when we first proposed to travel, the misfortunes that were to attend us.
Alas, they seem just as punishment for a crime, in presuming to wish to pry into secrets never intended to be revealed to man.
Can you believe it? Returned Edric. But in spite of all the misfortunes I have suffered, the restless curiosity to know the fate of the mummy we so strangely resuscitated is still one of my strongest feelings in my bosom.
I can readily credit it, for the doctor. For the same feeling operates upon me. It is, however, vain to indulge in useless regrets. We must die, and all we have to do is to endeavor to become resigned to our fate.
Damn, they just can't get a break. Chapter 21. A few days after this, the prisoners were honored by another visit from the alcalde. "Thank God!" cried Edric involuntarily as soon as he saw him, for as he felt confident that the anger he had expressed against him had been assumed, he hoped he was now come to save them.
"Alas," returned the worthy magistrate, "I fear you have little reason to be thankful, for my endeavours to save you have only succeeded in obtaining a few hours' respite, and tomorrow morning you are to be condemned to be burnt alive."
"Oh!" shrieked the doctor, whilst even Edric's courage could not prevent his turning deathly pale. "It is dreadful," he said, "to die thus. It is dreadful," said he, "to die thus so young in a foreign country, and by such fearful means."
"Shoo! Don't talk about it," sobbed the doctor. "My poor dear Edric! Save him, sir! In mercy, save him! Though I may be doomed to pay for the penalty of my folly, it is very hard he should suffer."
"It is indeed," returned the alcalde, "and my wish to save him, joined by the hatred I bear at the present general, has made me a traitor to my country. I see you look astonished, but to explain what I mean, it will be necessary to give you a short sketch of the present state of this country, which I will endeavor to do in as few words as possible. You know, no doubt, that Spain was once a powerful empire until the ill-judged policy of one of its monarchs, in removing the seat of government to Africa, occasioned her fall. For the tree of majesty becoming too widely extended, it was but natural that some of the branches should strike root for themselves, and detach themselves entirely from the parent stem. This was the case with Spain, and her first directors as a republic happened to be intelligent men. The infant state grew and flourished, exciting the admiration of its neighbors and the envy of its mother country. Unfortunately, however, the wheel of fortune is always spinning, and Spaniards, as I said, not knowing where to stop, have gone on, getting worse and worse by degrees, till they have become the bigoted and intolerant wretches you have found them. In fact, the army now rules the state, and the people, finding the tyranny in the soldiers insupportable, have been for some time attempting to throw off the yoke. They were long unsuccessful, and they found that discipline to the soldiers far outweighed all their bravery and self-devotion. In their distress, however, they called in the aid of Roderick II, the young and warlike king of Ireland. This powerful monarch, who realizes himself in all the romantic qualities of the ancient knights of chivalry, hastened instantly to their assistance, and they now are combating under his auspices with every prospect of success. His progress has been magical. Success has followed wherever he has gone, and his army now lies at a little distance, though he landed north of Spain. It is to him, therefore, that I have sent secretly, giving him, in the hope of saving you, instructions, by which, if he follows them, he cannot fail of surprising the camp. The doctor and Edric, though they were fully aware that they were principally indebted to the hatred of the alcalde bore the present general for the steps they had taken on their behalf, yet felt expressed themselves properly grateful, and the alcalde quitted the prison, leaving the flatterer Hope behind to console them for his absence, mingled, however, with his natural anxiety, which they could not help feeling, lest that well-arranged plan laid for their escape should fail. Morning had just dawned after a tedious and miserable night, and the doctor and Edric were yet shivering in the cold damp which often precedes the break of day, and which now seemed to have struck a chill to their inmost souls. and when the door of the prison was opened and a file of soldiers appeared, ready to conduct them to their place of execution, the doctor's heart beat thick, so as to impede respiration, and the heavy foam spread before his eyes. Whilst the agitation of Edric, who had, however, now quite forgiven him, was scarcely inferior to his own. Fervently they embraced, and then submitted to being pinioned. They were forced to march to the spot appointed for their sacrifice, where an eminent crowd awaited their approach. The doctor's heart sunk within him as he looked down from a kind of terrace upon which the ceremony was to take place. Upon the mass of human heads jammed together below, every face regarding him with a gaze of anxious expectation, and as he turned from these eager looks with a thrill of horror, his feelings were not more forcibly harrowed up by the sight behind him. This was composed of 2 iron stakes fixed firmly in the ground, and provided with ponderous chains as to prevent the remotest possibility of escape, whilst the enormous heaps of green wood piled around each gave a frightful idea of the intensity of the lingering torments the unfortunate prisoners were condemned to suffer. To the mind of Eric, in the meantime, which was not much more composed than that of his friend, he had also looked around, and whilst nature shuddered at the thought of the horrid death awaiting them, the immensity and compactness of the crowd seemed to destroy all probability of a rescue, and the hope which had till then been supported him fled from his breast. Whilst, as his eyes again met those poor doctor, mournful indeed was the glance that they exchanged. It is an awful thing to die, and though there are occasions that death may be braved, or at least met with unabated courage, yet when it comes on thus slowly and deliberately, seen from far off, and yet impossible to be avoided, the firmest mind will find it difficult to bear its approach unmoved. Thank you for the bits. That of Edric, however, notwithstanding it, had been weakened by his long confinement, and by the delusive flattery of hope, did not shrink from the trial, and calmly he even saw the crowd divide to make way for the executioner, who slowly advanced, preceded by a band of martial music, playing a mournful air, the drums being covered with black crape, and followed by a long train of soldiers in mourning cloaks with their arms reversed. Nothing could be more appalling than this lugubrious procession, the executioner, musicians, and soldiers being all shrouded in their gloomy cloaks, the very hoods of which were drawn over their heads, had the air of demons coming to bear away the miserable victims to everlasting perdition, and the mind of the unhappy doctor not being able to endure such accumulated horrors, he sunk upon his knees, uttering shrieks of anguish, whilst the cold sweat ran down in large drops from his forehead, and every nerve quivered with agony. The procession had now nearly reached the prisoners, and even Edric's firmness gave way, as he saw the executioner spring upon the terrace and advance towards him. A convulsive throb of anguish seemed to rend his heart, and his lips and cheeks turned to livid paleness, but how he was surprised with a sudden revulsion of feeling he did not experience, when the supposed executioner, after having unbound his arms, put a sword in his hands, whispering, "Now is the time to defend yourself. Our soldiers are in the green," and left him completely free. Completely overcome, Edric stood for a moment lost in amazement, unable to credit the evidence of his senses, and gazing after his deliverer, who, the moment he had unbound the doctor, threw off his disguise and shouted, "Roderick forever!" disclosed to the multitude below the dreaded form of the Irish hero himself. Shouts of "Roderick forever!" now rent the skies, and the soldiers who had followed their monarch, and several others who had lurked concealed amongst the crowd, threw off their disguises at the same moment, and formed around the leader, whilst the main body of his troops, left behind in the care of the experienced generals, tutored for the purpose, charged with the affrighted Spaniards in the rear. Thank you for that drink. The confusion and dismay that now prevailed were quite beyond description. The terrified Spaniards, who, naturally superstitious, had long fancied the wondrous acts of heroic valor attributed to Roderick, could only be performed by magic, were now fully convinced that his sudden appearance amongst them was an act of especial favor from his infernal majesty himself, and finding themselves attacked on all sides, imagined their enemies multiplied by the powers of darkness, and fled without striking a blow. Roderick and his soldiers returned laughing after they had pursued them a little way, to ransack and burn their camp, which when they had done, they retired to their former station, having previously presumed the alcalde to spare the town, and not to push the consequences of their victory farther. The doctor and Edric, who had been too much agitated to take a very active part in the combat, had been conveyed by the guards of Roderick to their master's camp, to await there the return of his monarch, in whose hands destiny had now placed them. Neither of our travelers had noticed the person of the Irish king when in the bustling moment of the deliverance, but almost magical serenity with which he had conveyed to disperse enemies, the evident terror with which the very name seemed to inspire the Spaniards, and the wondrous feats of the guards around them seemed to delight in attributing them, made them now almost tremble at the thought of being presented to so tremendous a personage, whom they assumed themselves in picturing as a stern, fearful tyrant, breathing nothing but war and desolation. Roderick II, surnamed the Great, was then in the flower of his age. He had not long ascended to his throne, and his father, who had been a prudent prince, having left behind him a well-established government, able statesmen, and a considerable sum in the treasury, Roderick had little to employ his mind at home. Brave, ardent, and enterprising, burning for conquest and spurning the quiet domestic peace, the overtures of the Spaniards had met his most ardent wishes, and he had embraced their cause with an eagerness and impetuosity that had hitherto carried everything before it. The great part of Spain lay at his feet. Even Madrid was his, but it was to attack Seville as the queen of the cities that he was now in Andalusia. The city was still in the power of his enemies, and Roderick, having made Cadiz his headquarters, was about removing there, when the message of the alcalde had induced to undertake the romantic enterprise that had just so successfully accomplished. Romance was, indeed, the leading feature in Roderick's character. It had been the policy of his father, the late king, to foment secretly the discontents malnourished amongst the English, and the spirit that Roderick revolted at the conduct he considered so mean at the base. The Spanish War, on the contrary, exactly suited his disposition to aid an oppressed people, to throw off the yoke of their oppressors, seemed noble and generous, and he engaged in the enterprise with all the energy of his bold and daring temper. His soldiers adored him, and his people warmly seconded his efforts, for as the seat of war was far removed from them, and as the treasurer of the late king defrayed expenses, they felt none of the inconveniences of war, and gloried the triumphs of their sovereign. Thus Roderick's praise was the theme of every tongue. Even the Spaniards worshipped him almost as a god, and their attractive imaginations magnified his exploits, till both friends and foes alike regarded him as a being who had only to will to conquer, and whose prowess it was perfect madness to even struggle to resist. Such a monarch our travelers now anxiously awaited, till the suspense became almost agony. At last the joyful sounds of here he comes, long live the mighty Roderick!" burst upon their ears, and the travelers bent forwards, eagerly expecting, yet dreading to see, a countenance stern and fearful as that of Cheops in his tomb. But how were they astonished to behold that the redoubtable Roderick, only a tall, handsome young man, riding carelessly upon a beautiful Barbary charger, and laughing and talking gaily with his officers when he came along.
"What?" cried the doctor indignantly. "Would you attempt to make me believe that the slight blooming boy is a conqueror? The thing is impossible. It is quite ridiculous to mention it. Those laughing eyes, smooth down-like cheeks, white teeth, they may as well be adapted to a lady's heart, as I am sure they never belonged to a hero."
The king, in the meantime, was equally struck with the doctor, and seeing something particularly honest and simple in this fat, round, oily face, he felt a lively interest in him, an excessive curiosity to know what could possibly have brought the man, apparently so harmless and inoffensive, into the perilous situation. The fine person of Edric, disfigured by the troubles he had undergone, also attracted his attention. and he rode up to his guests to question him as their adventures. The noble bard that carried him paced proudly along, though conscious of a little illustration he bore. Even the doctor was compelled to admit the face and the figure of the rider bespoke firmness, intellect, and dignity. "What crime have you committed against the Spaniards?" asked he, when he approached, addressing himself to the doctor in a full, mellow yet commanding tone. "It must have been the blackest dye, if they are to judge by the enormity of the punishment."
"I am innocent," cried the doctor, "and may it please your majesty, I am quite innocent."
"It will please me very much to find you so," said Roderick, smiling. "But assertion is nothing. What proof have you?"
"My friend here will bear witness in my behalf,"
said the doctor solemnly, not feeling at all pleased with what he thought the king's unreasonable disposition for merriment. Whilst, as he stood looking very cross, his red face and bald head steaming with perspiration and anger and vexation, his clothes having been torn to rags, and his hat and wig lost in his late troubles, he struck Roderick as presenting so very whimsical and ridiculous a figure that, after looking at him for a few minutes, the merry monarch burst into a violent and almost convulsive fit of laughter.
"Well," said the doctor, still more gravely, "I am glad your majesty seems so well amused, but for my part I don't see anything at all agreeable or entertaining about being buried alive."
The doctor solemnly looked in lengthened face, and as he made his naive remonstrance, he only increased Roderick's peals of laughter. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, addressing Edric, as soon as he was able to speak. "I really beg your pardon, but your friend here is so exceedingly amusing that I am really under infinite obligations to him, and know not how I shall ever be able to repay him." "It is we who are under obligations to your majesty, for which you can never sufficiently be grateful," said Eric gravely, for he also was not very well pleased at seeing his friend so openly ridiculed, as though he did sometimes take the liberty of smiling at the learned doctor's innocent follies himself. He did not like to see him made the laughing-stock of another. Roderick, however, saw that instantly understood the ill humour of Edric, and as he applauded his motive, he endeavoured to divert it by every means in his power, and soon completely succeeded. Few people, indeed, knew so well how to make themselves agreeable as Roderick, and though Edric at first felt indignant that the king should treat him like such a child, as to suppose his displeasure could easily be joked away, yet his feeling insensibly wore off, and soon he thought of Roderick as the most fascinating of human beings. Indeed, that heart must have been hard that could have withstood unmoved the fascination of Roderick when he wished to please. His bright laughing eyes that looked the very colour of gladness, his arch smile might have been subdued to melancholy of a stoic, whilst his characteristic had something bewitching in his very failings. He had been all his life the spoiled child of fortune, and though his rashness and impetuosity, his patronage and his caressing manner, his braveness, haughtiness, and obstinacy, his fondness for anything that proved a frolic, and his chivalrous notion to noble and grand enterprises formed a singular mélange, he was, perhaps, more beloved than he would have been if his character had been more perfect, and it was this very inconsistency that made him so completely the idol of his soldiers. "Believe me," he said, addressing Edric, "that it is impossible for me to describe the pleasure I feel of having had it in my power to be of service to you, and though I should have been happy to relieve my fellow creatures in distress, yet I must own I am glad that you are Englishmen. It was a policy of my late father to act as an enemy of the England, but I have always been her friend. I am such of nature intended English and Irish for brethren, and I am too sincere a devotee of the goddess to wish, even in the slightest degree, to counteract her designs." "Your sentiments perfectly coincide with mine," said Edric, "and as it has been my fate to live in the habits of intimacy of several years with a very worthy countryman of yours, Father Murphy, confessor of Duke of Cornwall, who was the most intimate friend of my father." "Father Murphy!" interrupted Roderick. "Yes," returned Edric, surprised with the wondered expression of the king. "Is it possible that you can know him?" "The name appeared familiar to me, that was all," replied Roderick, evidently finding it difficult to repress a strong inclination to laugh. Edric looked at him with still increasing astonishment, not being able to discover anything in the slightest degree ridiculous in what he had said. Roderick's disposition to mirth seemed to increase to the exact proportion of Edric's gravity. At length, perceiving he remained silent, Roderick with infinite difficulty contrived to say, "Go on, my dear Montague. I entreat you to go on. Never mind me. It is a strange doubt that has just entered my head." "Mr. Montague!" exclaimed Edric. "I was not aware that your Majesty was acquainted with my name. I do not recollect having mentioned it." "Perhaps, however, the doctor did," returned the king, "or the alcalde might have told me, or my servants might have seen it marked on your trunks, on your linen, or—" "Your Majesty need not give yourself so much trouble to explain a circumstance in itself perfectly immaterial," replied Edric. "I have no wish to conceal my name, and I only was astonished to find your Majesty so well acquainted with it." "Well, well," cried Edric, somewhat impatiently, "the circumstance is, as you say, quite immaterial. Pray go on with what you were saying of Father Murphy." "I simply observing that his Excellence has the disposition given me a favourable opinion of your Majesty's countrymen." "Which I hope the thoughtlessness of the king will not induce you to change. I trust you have too much good sense, Mr. Montague, to feel offended that you may call my frivolity in my manner. My heart, I hope, is good, though I own even I cannot say much in favour for my head. I am a laughing philosopher, however, a sort of Democritus in second, and finding it more agreeable to laugh than cry. I generally try to find amusement from everything that happens to fall in my way. We shall soon know each other better, and so now, as doubtless you may wish to repose after the fatigues you have undergone, you will perhaps like to retire to the tent we prepared for you." The doctor and Edric willingly assented and repaired to the new abode, completely puzzled by what seemed to them the extraordinary and inconsistent character of the king. Under this gay, laughing exterior, however, Roderick hid a sound, penetrating mind, and a firm, determined spirit, whilst, though no one enjoyed more to ridicule the occasional foibles of his subjects, no one knew better how to check them and bring them back instantly to their proper stations, if they ventured a hair's breadth within the limits he prescribed to them. He had thus the art to make himself feared as well as loved, and to rule his subjects despotically, though he never spoke to them without a smile. Such as I have described him, it may be easily imagined Roderick was not long for winning the affections of his new friends, and he, in turn, was equally delighted with him. The noble, generous, and inquiring spirit of Edric exactly accorded with his own, and the follies of the learned doctor afforded him never-ceasing amusement, whilst Edric, delighted to meet with a companion who could understand and sympathize with his feelings, felt happier than he had been for years, and the learned doctor, proud of being admitted to the intimacy of such a man as Roderick, declared all his troubles were repaid, and that he now considered himself one of the most fortunate of mortals. Oh. Thank you for the stretch and hydrate. I'm going to go ahead and push the ads. I had to pause them so I could get the last page and a half read. So, be back in a bit.
Who's a good boy?
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Okay. Buckish. Hey, Squall. Welcome in. My captions are really horrible at figuring out what I say. Mike actions really orbit $1 at... Yeah. My captions are just nuts. Anyway. That's 2 chapters down. Which isn't bad for an hour. Okay, so let's see. The Germans were chased out of Italy. Ireland is taking over Spain. The main government of Spain is in Africa. I would hate to try to keep up with a map of this book. Just thinking of an Irish army taking over Spain. Not sure how I'd do with tentacles. Anyway, get back to the book. Chapter 22. The Spanish nobility were daily collecting round the Irish king. To one of the most distinguished of these, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, Roderick was particularly anxious to introduce Edric. For this purpose, therefore, as soon as the army of Roderick returned to his headquarters in Cadiz, where the Duke had remained, the friends went together to pay him a visit. Edric was exceedingly interested by this call. The Duke's family consisted only of himself and his granddaughter, the Princess Zoe, but the appearance of both was exceedingly striking. The Duke was a blind old man with white flowing hair and a long silvery beard, clad with almost patriarchal simplicity, whilst Zoe, who sat close by his side, seemed devoted to his comfort, was the beauty herself. Exquisite lovely features, or her features were, they excited rather pains of pleasure to the mind of the beholder from their excessive paleness. Her dress was simple, a robe of black silk fitted tight to her slender shape, and her jet black hair was simply braided on her forehead and confined in a net behind. When she saw the strangers, a slight blush stained her usual alabaster features of her complexion, and a trifling agitation was visible in her manner. It was but for an instant, however, that this glowing tint suffused her pallid cheeks, and that of her fine features betrayed agitation. Her usual calm dignity of expression was immediately resumed, and her countenance remained its marble whiteness. There was, indeed, something very singular about the whole countenance of this young beauty, for notwithstanding the exquisite loveliness of her features, her charms were rather those of a statue than of a human being. Her fine features were strictly Grecian and perfectly regular, but they were always fixed in one unvarying expression, whilst her large black eyes, fringed with long silken lashes, and her glossy raven hair, contrasted slightly with the spotless fairness of her complexion, and gave her whole an air of some unearthly visitant from the tomb. Zoe had been unfortunate from birth. Her mother, having accompanied the old Duke upon the embassy to Constantinople, had happened to please the fancy of the reigning heir so forcibly that, contrary to the advice of his counselors, he had married her. Disproportioned marriages, however, are seldom happy ones, and the parents of Zoe formed no exception to the general rule. The emperor soon repented his rashness, and, becoming tired of his wife, treated her with a coldness and neglect, while she, far removed from her former friends, and finding herself despised by the man whose sake she had sacrificed everything, lingered a few years, and then died, unheeded and forlorn, leaving only the hapless Zoe to lament her fate. The emperor married again, and Zoe had dragged on a miserable existence, till in an insurrection of the Greeks her father had been murdered, and she herself compelled to fly from Constantinople. She had repaired first to Africa, but finding her grandfather was in Spain, she had followed him there, and still remained with him, under the protection of Roderick. It was, indeed, the aristocracy of Spain for which the Irish hero was now principally fighting, for they had suffered most severely from the litigious conduct of the soldiers, and were most earnest in imploring his existence. When the seats of the Spanish monarchy had been moved to Africa, most of the nobles had followed in its train, whilst those that remained had become subjects of the hate and suspicion of the Republican governments that ensued. Still, however, the amor patria glowed strongly in their breasts, and chained them to their country. They submitted patiently to innumerable grievances till, a few months before they applied to Roderick, finding the insolence of the soldiers become insupportable, they determined to throw off the yoke and re-establish a monarchy in Spain. For this purpose they had invited Don Pedro, a younger branch of their former royal family, to come from Africa to accept their throne. He complied, and had brought in his train many of old nobility, and amongst the rest of the venerable Duke of Medina Sidonia, whose most passionate wish was that he die be entombed in Spain. Don Pedro had been unsuccessful, and had fled, but many of those who had accompanied him still remained, and with the resident Spanish nobility now formed the splendid court of Roderick at Cadiz. The Duke received Edric kindly, and treated Roderick with that enthusiastic devotion which is, beyond all other praise, flattering to the mind of men. Zoe never spoke, nor did her features betray that she took the slightest interest in the scene before her. It has been before observed that education was carried to such a pitch in England that all, even the common people, were universal linguists, instructed indeed that in respect was imparted in many brief and ingenious modes, and knowledge being thus rendered so cheap and easy as to be a la portia de tout le monde, It is, of course, was going partially out of fashion with the higher classes. But as Sir Ambrose piqued himself to his devotion to all of the old customs, he would not swerve from them in the education of his sons, and in eloquence, Edric was most learned of his aspects. Edric was almost as learned in this respect as a servant or a laborer. This had often been a source of chagrin to him at home, as this prevented him feeling on equal terms with those of the same situation of life as his, and had contributed greatly to give them those shy and reserved manners we have noticed. On the present occasion, however, Edric found his learning advantageous, as it enabled him to enjoy thoroughly the animated and entertaining conversation of the old Duke. After a lively and spirited discussion of the manners of age generally, and the state of Spain in particular, the friends retired, having first obtained a promise from the Duke and Zoe to be present at the grand tournament Roderick intended on giving the following day. "Well, Edric," said Roderick, "what do you think of Princess Zoe?" "That she would be Venus de Meneticus, if she had a little more soul." "Oh, come, Edric," said Roderick, laughing, "that is really too bad. I will allow Zoe wants animation, but she has less as much as statue. Besides, I thought you were fond of still life, as you would not have been so anxious about your mummy." "Oh, for God's sake," said Edric, "do not joke upon that subject. It's too solemn, too awful." "At least your doubts are now satisfied," said the king. "Not at all," said Edric, "for I cannot help imagining it was only permitted to appear resuscitated to punish my presumptuous daring and its mysterious disappearance, added to the strange and fearful adventures that have since attended us, only confirm my opinion." "It must have been a horrible feeling when you first saw it stir," observed Roderick. "Words cannot express the agony of that moment," said Edric. "When I saw my strange and earthly wishes gratified, and felt the impiety I had been guilty of in having formed them, and I would have given worlds to restore the mummy to his deep sleep I had disturbed. It was, however, too late." "Can you form any idea of what has become of it?" "None. If the Egyptian story be correct, it contrived to reinflate the balloon and then carried it away, though it is quite impossible to say how far it might go, as the mummy could not possibly understand the management of the machine, though he might accidentally fill it." "Would it relieve you to think that the mummy is safe in England?" "Oh, no, I shudder at the thought." "Oh, well, then it is useless to make yourself unhappy about that subject. Depend upon it, all is for the best, I am sure, for my part. I am very much obliged to the resuscitated gentleman, as if it had not been for his freak of flying away in your balloon, he would not have been here at the present moment, and I might never have known that such a person was in existence. However, now you are here. You must not leave me, and when we have finished our campaign, we will return to Ireland together, and pass the remainder of our lives in peace and tranquillity." Edric smiled, for the very idea of peace and Roderick seemed incongruous. The tournament was held on a fine plain in the mainland, a few miles from Cadiz, and nothing could exceed the brilliancy of the show. "The sun shone over fair women and brave men," for even in winter the bright beams of the Andalusian sun gave a glowing animation to the scene. The busy murmurs of the crowd, the prancing of the horses, and the gay laugh of the light-hearted Irishmen as they paid their high-flown compliments to the Spanish beauties, were, however, soon interrupted by the firing of cannon, and a pause ensued, which was at length broken by the loud shouts of "Roderick! Roderick forever! Long live the conqueror of Spain!" And immediately the pressure and bustle of the people, and the sound of warlike music which gradually swelled upon the ear, announced the arrival that the illustrious sovereign was on the field. Roderick was, as usual, riding upon Champion, his noble barb, and surrounded by the officers of his staff, but he was not talking to them with his accustomed familiarity. His countenance even wore an air of sadness and reflection, very unusual to it. However, as he rode along, his fine horse tossing his head and spurning the ground as he advanced, he looked completely the powerful sovereign that he really was. This dress was exceedingly becoming. Roderick knew mankind too well to not appear to adopt it, in some measure, to the prejudices of those he associated with, and knowing the partiality of the Spaniards for dress and appearance, his own was magnificent. A tight vest and pantaloons of black satin displayed the elegance of his figure to the best advantage, whilst a short cloak of the same material hung from his shoulders in a graceful negligence, and his head was covered with a large Spanish hat of black velvet, having a magnificent plume of ostrich feathers secured by a diamond aigrette in front. A superb collar of diamonds also adorned his breast, and a deep frill of Vandyke lace was fastened around his neck. Splendid, however, as was the attire of Roderick, it was exceeded by his own personal advantages. No one could look upon that fair, open brow, those bright blue eyes, that manly, though youthful form, that glossy chestnut hair, and the curling mustachios, or, what was more than all, upon the fascinating smile of the mouth it decorated, without feeling deeply interested in the processor. The fascinating manners of Roderick had already been mentioned, but at the present occasion his usual gaieté de vivre was tempered by an air of dignity and command which became him equally well, and which powerfully told, that he might sometimes condescend to seem amused with trifles, he would, when he pleased, be indeed a king. The affairs of Spain were now beginning to assume a favorable appearance, and consequently the people were more disposed to amuse, whilst, as a truce had been granted for some weeks, during the negotiation for peace which was carrying on, the combined Spanish and Irish soldiers shut up on the Isle of Leon, then thrown entirely upon their own resources for amusement, like most persons in similar situations, grasped eagerly at every trifle that seemed to promise variety and amusement. Roderick was perfectly aware of this, and it was partly to afford employment for his officers, and partly to gratify his own taste of the pursuits of chivalry, that he had proposed to the present tournament. The lists were marked out, and the flourish of trumpets summoned the combatants to the field. Two of the Irish officers were the first who engaged, and whilst every eye was occupied in watching the movements of their most intense anxiety, Roderick took an opportunity of whispering to Edric that he had just received news from England. "Well?" cried Edric, his eyes sparkling with impatience. "Elvira is elected, but I'm afraid there's a strong party in the state against her." "And my father?" "He is well, and Edmund is prime minister." "What says Rosabella?" "She is silent, and therefore I fear you're right. In such a case, Rosabella's silence can only portend a storm." "The Duke has left the country, and now resides entirely in town." "What a change!" said Edric. "A few short months have produced. All is altered. I was excessively shocked when you informed me of the death of Claudia, but this news, though it surprises, does not displease me. Thank God my father is well." The defeat of one of the combatants and the shouts of triumph attended the success of the other now interrupted the conference, and the rush of all parties towards the king separated him from Edric, who walked quietly away from the crowd to meditate upon the news he had just received. The train of thoughts thus conjured up so pleasing that he was soon completely lost in it. His father, his brother, and all the scenes of his childhood, those early recollections so dear to every heart, seemed to rise before him, and he had forgotten Spain and all that contained, when he was roused from his reverie by a piercing scream, and looking round, he saw the Princess Zoe, whose near Palanquin had accidentally placed himself, attempting to break her from her carriage in a state of the most violent agitation. Astonished beyond the power of expression at her emotion, Edric hastily assisted her to unfasten the door of her palanquin, and offered her his arm. Zoe took it without speaking, and trembling steps hurried across the plain. In a few minutes, however, the cause of the princess's agitation was explained, for as they approached the spot evidently wished to reach, Edric saw the body of Roderick extended on the ground, apparently without life or motion. Uttering an exclamation of horror, he attempted to rush towards him, and the princess held his arm firmly and prevented him. Quite astonished, she looked up at her face, and she was still dreadfully agitated, but she did not speak, and only pressed her finger against her lips. In a few minutes, Roderick opened his eyes, and the princess, again pressing Edric's arm, said in a hurry and low tone, "Let us go now." Edric obeyed, and they walked hastily back to the palanquin in perfect silence. When Edric had assisted the princess into her carriage, however, and was about to retire, She pressed his hand and said again in her particularly low, soft voice, "Do not speak of this." "I will not," said Edric, bowing respectfully as he pressed her hand to his lips. He walked away, excessively surprised at the scene he had witnessed. Upon reaching the king, he had found that he had been thrown from his horse, and so slightly hurt that as not to think it necessary to interrupt the amusements of the day, which concluded after a brilliant display of Irish and Spanish valor, without any other incident worthy of notice. A few days after this adventure, as Edric was sitting, lost in thought, in his own apartments, musing, as was custom when he was alone, upon the strange adventure of the mummy, and endeavoring in vain to imagine what might be its probable fate, he was startled by the door in the room flying suddenly open, and Roderick rushing in, pale and violent agitation. "Oh, Edric!" he cried, "I'm ruined! My fame is lost forever! Whilst I've been loitering away in my time, the enemy has obtained the assistance of the French, and they have taken Madrid, and almost all the towns between that and the frontier. An immense army is marching upon Seville, and they have intended blocking me here, amusing me with the pretended treaties till they caught me at their snare." "And how was your plot discovered?" "The Princess Zoe. Yes, I know what you would have to say. She loves me, and though I love her not, nay, I've been devoted to another. If I reconquer Spain, myself and crown will be thrown at your feet. But if I fail, I will never live to be the herald of my disgrace. It is unworthy of Roderick to despair. It will be of the treachery if you will be vanquished." "Hold!" cried Roderick, almost driven to a frenzy at the thought. "For mercy's sake, not so calmly about my being vanquished. I will conquer, I will redeem my name, and I will perish in the attempt. If they do vanquish me, it shall be my corpse alone that they shall conquer, for the immortal spirit shall escape their fury." "Alas, alas!" said Edric, "your words have again conjured up the fiend that so long has haunted me. Does the immortal spirit escape?" "Edric," returned the king, "this is not the moment for metaphysical subtleties. We must act, and that immediately and decisively. We must advance upon Seville, and, if possible, get possession of that city before the army of the enemy shall reach it. This blow will strike the Spaniards with awe, and they have recovered themselves. I shall have made myself master of half Spain. I know the character of the people I have combat. I must carry everything by a coup de main, or I shall fail." Lots of people speak French in this book. It was impossible to deny the justice of this observation, and Edric warmly seconded the preparations of Roderick to march immediately upon Seville. These preparations were soon made, for Roderick was so completely idolized by his soldiers that they regarded his will by his law, and were ready to march at an hour's notice, though they did not know where they were going. Dr. Entwerfen was excessively agitated when he found he was really going to engage in war. Not that the base emotion of fear took possession of his soul, but a slight trepidation, as was a scandal that even heroes feel in their first battle, crept over his nerves, and gave him an odd sensation which, he said, was only anxiety to engage. No one knew where they were going. It was only rumored, indeed, that hostilities were about to commence, and, as the doctor had said, it was very disagreeable to be acquainted with the theatre of their future glory. Roderick was amused, notwithstanding even the agitation of the moment, with the efforts of the doctor to discover the secret, and told him, as though in confidence, that they were going to attack Lisbon. Delighted with this news, which he firmly believed, the doctor strutted about with indescribable dignity, walking upon the tips of his toes, pressing his lips together, and swelling out his cheeks like a cherub in a country courtyard, whilst he seemed absolutely bursting with the importance of the secret he carried. All was now ready before Roderick quitted Cadiz. He took leave of the Princess Zoe. "It will be unjust to your merit and my gratitude," he said, "to insult you with words, but if I survive the devotion of my whole life—" "Stay," interrupted Zoe. "Over-agitate so strangely the value of the service I have been so fortunate as to render you. Besides, even if your estimate were just, know that the services of Zoe are not to be purchased. No, Prince, judge me not to mean so meanly. Had I not determined that we should never meet again, the intelligence you so highly value would have never reached your ears.
My greatest enemy is dead, and tomorrow I return to my native land, where the rebels have no longer power to injure me. Demetrius, the ancient minister of my father, arrived yesterday, with the permission for my return, and I do not hesitate an instant. Yet before I go— "Speak," cried Roderick nervously. "Command my life, my throne, my fortune." Zoe smiled. "The favor I have to request is trifling. I have a favorite page who dreads to return to Greece, and I would willingly place him under your care."
"He shall be my brother," said Roderick enthusiastically. "My friend, my companion in arms. He shall live with me, fight with me, and—" Again a faint smile played on Zoe's marble features, like the ghosts of departed joys, but in an instant, however, it added the fresh darkness to the preceding gloom.
"I wish no advantages from my page," she said gravely, "beyond those usually bestowed upon his class. Treat him kindly, and promise me you will not overindulge him, or I shall not leave him with you."
"You have only to command," said Roderick, "and you may rely upon obedience."
"Adieu, then," exclaimed the princess, extending her hand, whilst a slight blush sustained her alabaster complexion. "God bless you, and we may meet again."
Roderick kissed her hand as he would have done that of an empress. "Heaven grant we may," he exclaimed, "for rest assured no earthly pleasure could afford me half the joy."
"None?"
asked Zoe incredulously. "None," repeated he firmly, "unless, perhaps," added with a smile, "the reconquering of Spain."
"Then you will accept my page?"
"As a gift from heaven."
"He shall join you ere you cross the bridge. Once more, adieu."
"Adieu," cried Roderick, and Zoe vanished. In half an hour the troops were under arms and had quitted Cadiz, but Roderick, in the bustle and confusion attendant upon the removal of so large a body of men so suddenly, had quite forgotten the Greek page. As he was crossing the bridge, however, his noble barb started, and Roderick, looking for the cause, saw a slight, graceful boy who, kneeling, presented him with a letter. It was from Zoe.
"I forgot to tell you," she wrote, "that my page is done, and his loss of speech, however, was accidental. He is, notwithstanding, perfectly intelligent, and will obey your slightest gesture."
Ordering some of his attendants to provide a horse, Roderick desired the page to mount it and ride by his side. The boy crossed his arms upon his breast and bowed his head in token of obedience, then lightly vaulted into the saddle. Rendered dumb just means that they're speechless. I'm not sure why that came around as the term, but lots of different languages, well, English especially, I've used it for other meanings, like being dumbstruck. Basically means you're rendered speechless. So, dumb just means you don't speak. But it doesn't mean you don't hear, it doesn't mean you can't do other things. And that's our language lesson for the night. Let's see if I can get one more chapter done. Chapter 23. The army of Roderick advanced rapidly through the lovely country richly tinted by the rays of the southern sun. Nothing indeed could be more beautiful than the scene. Though spring was only just bursting from the icy chains of winter, vine-covered cottages peeped through the orange groves loaded with their fragrant flowers, whilst behind, the dark foliage of the lofty palm trees gave depth and richness to the landscape. Innumerable flowers permeated the air, and the sky glowed with azure and gold. Under these circumstances, the advance of Roderick's army, though rapid, resembled rather the journey of a party of pleasure than a fatiguing and toilsome march, and when, just as the sun was setting, they approached a small village, Edric paused on the summit of a hill to survey the delighted admiration of the lovely scene. A white church peeped from the thick of clusters of trees. A white church peeped from between a thick cluster of trees, and romantic cottages covered with wild festoons and luxuriant plants were scattered about in intervals, while sitting before the doors were placed groups of peasant girls, singing patriotic airs on the mandolins or flutes, and others were dancing gaily beneath the shade of some widely spreading trees. Neat dresses of black serge fitted tightly to the shape of these girls, and displayed the graceful elegance of their figures to the utmost advantage. Their long dark hair was bound in a simple net, and their sparkling eyes beamed with animation and love, and whilst the clear dark complexion, well-proportioned forms, jet black hair, and alkaline noses of their male partners, still, notwithstanding the lapse of so many centuries, strongly marked their Moorish origin. Songs of joy and lively music swelled upon the gale, but those sounds of peace and happiness were soon changed to shrieks of terror, as the unfortunate peasants saw the army of Roderick wind through the trees, and they fled screaming for mercy, whilst all the little store of wealth fell an easy prey to the foe they left behind. Edric shuddered at the pillage that ensued, and warmly remonstrated with his friend. "My dear Edric," said Roderick, "these things are inevitable, though what you see here can give you but a very faint idea of the dreadful havoc and devastation of war. My soldiers destroy nothing, and generally even pay for what they take, but commonly in an enemy's country men burn what they cannot make use of, and treat the unfortunate inhabitants with the most appalling cruelty. However, these are not things we reason about." "I think not," returned Edric, and finding his remonstrances unavailing, he had the discretion not again to allude to the subject till the armies approached Seville. The first view of the splendid city, illumined by the glowing rays of the setting sun, struck our young philosopher most forcefully. "Oh, Roderick!" he cried, "look at that long line of sumptuous palaces, adorned with marble pillars, and the finest statues, and those lovely gardens, those bowers of roses, those crystal fountains, whose sparkling spray looks dazzling in the sunbeams." "Well," said Roderick, "I see them all, and more, the lofty spires of the town rising beyond, their gilded vanes glittering in the sun." "And can you look upon this fair scene," asked Edric, "and not feel compunction? Alas, alas, that the cruel hand of man should dare destroy so lovely a picture!" "My dear Edric," returned Roderick, smiling, "you would never do for a conqueror. If you make war a profession, glory must be your mistress, and to obtain her you must sacrifice all your better feelings. But, what is that? Look yonder, Edric." "I see nothing but a volume of fleecy smoke curling between the trees," said Edric, "which harmonizes well with the lovely scene around, and that scene of the grief and of war is destined soon to desolate. Oh, Roderick, can it be possible that you, whose kind and charitable nature would not crush the worm to death unnecessarily, should—" "They have fired the suburbs," cried Roderick, interrupting him. And clapping spurs to his horse, he darted forward like an arrow discharged from a bow. His suspicions were correct. Light clouds of white vapor hung high in the clear blue heavens, whilst below, a thick yellow smoke mingled with flames spread wide ruin and devastation. Crackling pieces of wood, sparkling like a feu d'artifice, were thrown up with violence at intervals, and the scorching heat felt intolerable as sparks of showers and pieces of ignited matter rained thick and fast upon the plain. Edric and Roderick were on a gentle eminence when they first saw the city, and deceived by the remarkable optical delusion often observable for similar situations, they had even fancied that it was very near them. When they plunged into the valley, however, they soon discovered that this was very considerable extent, and the horses, weary with the toilsome march, with difficulty made their way through the thick underwood and tangled grass that every moment threatened to impede their progress. At length they entered into the mazes of wood that quite obscured the city from their sight, and when fair Seville again broke upon them, an opening in trees, she appeared one vast mass of flame. "Good heavens!" cried Edric. "Surely they will not burn the city? What a multitude of human beings will be sacrificed if they do!" "I hope they will not be so foolish," said Roderick. "Yet I own I fear— No," he cried after a moment's pause. See, the smoke divides. As the wind bears the rolling volumes asunder, the city's walls still stand. No fire has yet touched the glory and the bulwark of the proud yet fair Seville."
I'm in danger!
Fire!
The glowing embers still cracked as they approached, and still threw up occasional showers of sparks, fearfully glaring amidst the darkness of the night, which now closed in upon them in the thick gloom very unusual to that climate. The flames had caught the bridge ere the army of Roderick reached the banks of the river, and the fiery bow, glowing through the surrounding darkness, looked like a fabled arch over which the Mohattans believe the souls of the dead are destined to skate to paradise. At length the army of Roderick found the progress stopped by the deep, rapid waters of the Guadalquivir River, the black smoking remains of the bridge which had once stretched across the river seeming forbidden to further their progress. Magnificent palaces lay around them, crumbling into ruins, whilst their half-burnt roofs fell occasionally with a tremendous crash. Fearful indeed was the spectacle that presented itself, and the once superb suburb seemed the very temple of desolation. Faces and statues lay overturned and blackened by the smoke. Majestic trees, scorched by the flames, and their shriveled leaves stripped from their weathered branches, stretched forth their bare arms forlorn and desolate, like bereaved mothers mourning over their murdered children. A chill, drizzling mist began to fall, and looking dreary and uncomfortable. Roderick stood upon the banks of the river, and marked its dark, rolling waters, in which the fire that still crept among the ruins saw on the other side reflected in its red-lurid glare. "We must pass this river," he said. "These Andalusians are too crafty to destroy their fine suburb, and in itself a town, had not some impetuous reason urged them to do so. If they want to gain time, but we must show them that we dare brave the combined terrors of flames and water, and glory gives the word."
"And what is this glory you pursue so madly?" cried Edric. "May not prudence be admitted to its counsel? And will it not be more certain if we wait till morning to seize it? The night is dark and gloomy. I think it forebodes a tempest, and at any rate it will be difficult to ford this black rolling stream in the obscurity. Tomorrow will the dawn effect a safe passage. Our troops will then be refreshed and rest, and we shall be ready to encounter the rigors of dangers that may oppose us."
Roderick smiled sadly. "Tomorrow, Edric," said he, "it may be too late. Tomorrow the armies of our enemies may expect to advance upon us, either obtain possession of the town, or cut off our retreat. We have traitors amongst us, for even now secret of our movements have been. You see, the enemy has had notice of our approach."
"Why should we pause?" cried Lord Arthur O'Neill, one of the Irish lords who had followed the sovereign to the field. "Your Majesty may confide in your soldiers. Tired! An Irishman knows not the meaning of the word. Shall the heroes of Burgos, Valladolid, and Salamanca complain of fatigue? Have you forgotten how they fought and conquered? Have you forgotten the proud day before Madrid, when a handful of Irish fought and defeated a whole legion of Spaniards? Can we not think of these things, and yet talk of fear? Oh, no, surely not. Surely, if we, every warm drop of blood in our veins, every spark of enthusiasm in our hearts, would give to lie the assertion. Lead on, brave Roderick. Damp not the spirit of your troops by unnecessary delays, but lead us forward to victory." "Lead us to victory!" shouted the officers and the troops. And Roderick, animated by their cries, gave orders for an instant fording of the river. The evening had now quite closed in. Not a star broke in the thick, dull gray in the heavens, and the sky began to look dark and threatening. The lowering clouds grew gradually darker and darker, whilst a dusky veil seemed to fall over the distant turrets of the town, and to envelop them in gloom. The fire that still raged in the suburbs had now seized the ancient castle, and a thick yellow smoke burst from its embrasures. It seemed like a huge giant vomiting forth flames. In the meantime, heavy clouds that had gathered over their heads seemed big with destruction, and a low moaning sound was heard at the distance, as though the winds were sighing over the fate of the unhappy wretches who were soon to fall victims to their fury.
The hollow murmuring continued. It grew gradually louder and louder, and at length burst with tremendous violence in the fearful blasts of the heads of the enemy. It was now as dark as night. The thunder rolled with awful grandeur. The rain descended in torrents, and the flashes of lightning showed the glimpses of pouring vengeance from the clouds, and the still smoking fragments of a ruined bridge. It seemed madness to attempt to pass into the river in such a moment, but the determined spirit of Roderick, when once resolved, was not easily to be shaken, and crying out, "Glory to Roderick and forever!" he attempted to plunge into the boiling flood. At this instant the heavens seemed open, and a vivid ball of blue light fired and dart from them. The lightning had struck a tree, beneath which the group of soldiers had taken shelter, splitting it asunder and scattering the branches in all directions, whilst the groans of unhappy wretches, crushed by its fall, mingled horribly with the howling wind and crashing thunder. Nothing, however, could intimidate the daring spirit of Roderick, and calling upon his soldiers to follow him, he struck his spurs into Champion, his faithful barb, and the noble animal plunged with him into the stream. The river, swollen by the torrents of rain, now rushed along in roaring waves like the sea. Champion and the horses of those who had tried to follow the example of their sovereign were soon obliged to try to swim, and struggled in vain to reach the opposite shore. The impetuous current, however, swept them down the river, and soon the cries of the drowning men and the plunging of horses added fresh horror to the roar of the raging rivers. Fearful was the struggle. Still, after a few horrible moments of almost supernatural excursions, the storm partly ceased, and though the wind still continued to howl at intervals and the thunder to roll, the growl became fainter and fainter, and soon nothing was heard of the splashing of the waves and the struggles of the swimming animals who tried in vain to stem the boiling currents. Champion had made most valiant efforts to save his master, but he strove in vain, and he only floated upon the waves. No longer could he toss his head and proudly champ his bit. His strength was fast leaving him. His long, thick mane and heavy armor weighed him down. His feeble eyes, however, caught a glimpse of the opposite shore, and they almost reached it, and the noble animal, collecting all his strength for one attempt, sprang forward. But alas, his heart broke in the effort. His strength failed, the slippery clay slided from beneath his feet, and the lifeless body of poor Champion fell back into the river, dragging his illustrious master with him. Roderick was much too exhausted to swim, and encumbered by the dead body of his horse, he was fast sinking to rise no more, when a powerful arm caught hold of him. "Take this knife!" cried a voice that he knew was Edric's. "Disentangle yourself from the horse, and I will save you!" His words recalled the fleeting spirit of Roderick, and he grasped the knife and hastily cut asunder the cord that confined his cloak around his neck. It was his cloak that had become entangled with his saddle, and the moment it was released, the neck of Roderick it floated down the stream, and the body of poor Champion, whilst fainting monarch was dragged on shore by his friend Edric. The storm had now entirely ceased, the water began to get more tranquil, and the moon, breaking from the clouds, had drifted rapidly across the skies, showing the opposite bank so plainly that the rest of the army passed with little difficulty. In the meantime, restoratives had been applied to Roderick, and he opened his eyes. A slight shudder, however, ran through his frame as he looked around, and heaving a deep sigh, he hastily reclosed them, as though he wished to shut out forever the recollection of what had just passed. It was but for an instant, however, that the manly mind of the Irish hero indulged in this overwhelming sorrow. The next, smiling, though mournfully, he took the hand of Edric, and looking at him with affection, he said, "I owe my life to you. God only knows whether the boon be worth the need for thanks, or whether you have not been cruel to my people in saving me. They have a small reason to wish to live, if I am often to be seized by such freaks as these. Good God! I shudder when I consider that the lives of several of my fellow creatures have been sacrificed to my misguided folly. Poor Champion, too." Drawing his hand across his eyes to wipe away his tears, and then again trying to smile. "You will laugh at me, Edric, but you don't know how much I feel the loss of that horse. Poor fellow, how nobly he breasted its side and struggled on, but he is gone, and it's no use thinking of him." And as he spoke, he resolutely started from his bed upon which he had been laid, and dashed again the tears from his eyes. I've other things to think of that are far more important than the poor champion. And yet, poor fellow, I can't forget his obedience to me that destroyed him. Poor fellow, he would have been sorry for him, Edric, if he had heard how deeply he sighed when we were in the middle of the water, and I forced him to go on. But I will think no more of him. Summon my officers, and let us hold a council to our future proceedings. The council was called, and it was soon ascertained that the army had sustained no other loss than poor Champion and a few horses, and about 8 or 10 of the king's bodyguard, who had thrown themselves into the river the moment they had seen their master do so. Roderick felt keenly the folly that had occasioned the loss of these brave men and animals, but as he was aware that he was now surrounded by soldiers and the allied Spaniards, then that was always necessary for a monarch to be seen great, whether he be so or not, if he wished to be obeyed. He had too much self-command to show any signs of weakness, and gave orders for the commencement of the siege of the town, with as much coolness as though he had merely quietly marched up to its wall. In the meantime, Dr. Entwerfen had safely floated over the stream, riding across one of the ammunition wagons, which were contrived of cork and supported by bladders, or rather balloons, filled with the gas upon each side, whilst the middle part, upon which the doctor rode, being nearly in the form of a barrel, the worthy gentleman had formed no bad representation of Bacchus as he swam merrily across, for the learned doctor, having wisely considered how much interest in science would suffer if any accident befall his precious person, had waited till the river was as smooth as glass, before he would venture to traverse it. It was perhaps also well for Roderick that he now found himself upon the theatre of war, and that he had orders to give, decisions to make, in short, that he had sufficient to occupy his mind, and prevent its dwelling upon the unpleasant circumstances that had just passed. Occupation, indeed, is the only sure remedy for grief. The consolations of friends and hopes of religion may do much, but the constant employment is the most effectual medicine for woe that the skill of man has yet able to discover. Roderick now enjoyed the benefit of his invaluable panacea of the fullest extent, for he had much to do. Notwithstanding all their affection for him, his army could not conceal from themselves that he had sacrificed several valuable lives unnecessarily by his rashness, and their confidence in his prudence was proportionally diminished. Roderick saw, and was mortified by this, the more so as he felt it was occasioned by his own folly, and he struggled to do something to retrieve the confidence he had lost. There is, perhaps, no situation more painful to a noble, high-spirited man than the consciousness of error, and the feeling that Roderick upon his occasion were an ample penance of his faults. During the whole of the passage of the river, and the encampment of the army upon the opposite side, under the very walls of the city, not a single soldier of the enemy had been seen, but when that was completed, and the harassed host of Irish had stretched their weary limbs upon the earth, to seek a few moments' repose before the attack that was ordered at daybreak, lights could plainly be seen moving to and fro in the city, and the heavy tramp of the soldiers heard as they prepared the walls. All now was still. A calm seemed to be succeeded a mighty tempest. A tent had been erected for Roderick and his chief officers, and there the monarch now sat gloomily musing, whilst his officers were scattered in various attitudes of repose and thoughts around him. Alexis, the Greek page, who had with difficulty passed the river, lay at his feet. At length all slept but Edric and Roderick. After a long pause, the Irish hero looked to his friend, and seeing him gazing at him with a look of tenderest concern, "Edric," he said, "I suffocate here. Will you walk forth?" Edric willingly consented, and they sallied from the tent. The moon now shone brightly, and the night was calm and still. They walked towards the banks of the river. Those waters which so lately had raged like a roaring lion seemed to devour, now rippled gently along, dancing in the sunbeams, and seeming almost to smile in mischief at what they had done. Roderick could not bear the sight. Remorse for his impudence struck like a barbed arrow through his heart, and he hastily turned away. He now looked at the scene that lay before him towards the town. The moon shone brightly upon the tents of his soldiers, which contrasted strongly with the black and disfigured ruins of the suburb, amongst which they had been hastily pitched. Whilst the lights of the city, seen only from the summit of the walls, made it look like an eagle's nest suspended between heaven and earth. Roderick grasped Eric's hand. "Calm now," he cried. "How peaceful seems the scene before us. Alas, how different from what you lately. But, what's that?" he exclaimed, suddenly interrupting himself. Surely I heard a groan. Edric listened, and distinctly heard the feeble moaning of a human voice. Neither Roderick nor himself uttered a syllable, but both darted to the spots from whence the sound proceeded. Just at the bend of the river, surrounded by lofty trees, now scorched and half destroyed by the fire, stood the mansion de plaisance of one of the Spanish nobles. It had been built in the Italian style. Hedges of myrtle and pomegranates had bloomed in the garden, and a raised terrace now surrounded the house, ornamented with statues. Now, however, the terrace was covered with fallen pillars and broken vases. Ruin and desolation spread around. The trellis work, against which different creeping shrubs had been trained, hung in wild disorder, torn from the walls and crushing with its weight the shrubs to which it had once served as supports. Edric and Roderick entered the dwelling, for the cry seemed to proceed from its ruins. With hasty steps they traversed the deserted chambers in which the magnificent tapestry hung in tatters on the wall, while shattered remnants of valuable pictures and shivered mirrors showed the grandeur that had once been there. All now, however, was desolation. The gilded walls and ceilings looked black with smoke, and the splendid furniture lay half burnt and half destroyed upon the ground. Roderick and Edric, however, did not stop long to survey the misery around them, for they hastily hurried towards the place from which the cries had proceeded. As they approached, they found there was a sense of a female voice that had attracted them, and advanced a few steps further, they beheld a sight that filled them with pity. Beneath the fallen column, in the ruins of which she was so entangled she could not move, lay, or rather stooped, a beautiful female, bending over an apparently lifeless body of an old man, whose fine features and venerable appearance were sufficient of themselves to create deep interest on his behalf, but which interest was trebly increased by the evident anxiety painted upon the beautiful face of the female. "Oh, heavens!" cried she, as soon as they approached. "If you have any mercy or Christian charity in your disposition, secure this old man. The cruel wretches have left him here to perish miserably. Though we are strangers, we are human beings, and have committed no crime." By this time, Edric and Roderick had arrived near enough to draw her from the column, when they perceived, to their infinite terror, that her arm was broken, and that she was otherwise seriously hurt. "Oh, think not of me," cried she, finding they wished to scour her before they attended the old man, who appeared to be dead. "Save my father. I'm quite well. Can I help you?" And heedless to her own pain, the heroic girl assisted in dragging her father from his dangerous situation. "I fear he is dead," whispered Roderick. "Oh, say not so," shrieked Pauline, for that was her name. He shall recover. Give him air," continued she, endeavoring with one trembling hand to use which enabled her to unfasten his collar. Edric gazed at her with admiration, and struck with her filial piety and generous self-forgiveness, he felt an interest for her that he had never before experienced for a woman. He assisted her pious cares, and finding the old man still insensible, he bore him in his arms to the banks of the river, and sprinkled him with its waters. Whilst he was thus engaged, the little fat Dr Entwerfen, quite out of breath with his exertions, came puffing in something between a trot and a run. "Oh, Edric, my dear!" he cried, gasping for breath. "I've found you, but hey, Eddie, what's this matter? You haven't been killing anybody, have you?" "Doctor," exclaimed Edric, "I am rejoiced to see you. This gentleman has been hurt by some falling ruins. Will you bleed him?" The doctor had studied surgery in his youth, and had since practiced frequently for charity, and being in all things in which his particular foibles were not concerned, a man of sense and feeling. He instantly comprehended the importance of the case, and drawing forth his lancet, after having first buried and bound up the arm of his patient, he bled him. At first the doctor dropped slowly, drop by drop, but it soon began to flow more freely, and then the patient, heaving a deep sigh, opened his eyes. Pauline had been bending over her father with the intenseness of an anxiety that represented every personal feeling, But the moment she heard him sigh, the unnatural strength that had supported her gave way. Nature could bear no more, and she fell senseless to the ground. Everyone flew to her assistance, and Dr. Entwerfen, in particular, was quite in agony.
"Dear pretty creature,"
he cried, pushing his wig on the side, and hurried to raise her up.
"Pretty dear, I do declare the arm is broken, and you should shoulder dreadfully lacerated. Poor thing, I wonder how she could contrive to hold up so long."
"It is wonderful," repeated Edric. "It is the triumph of mental energy over bodily suffering." "See, she opens her eyes, she survives," exclaimed Roderick. "Had I not better return to my tent for assistance?"
"There are some soldiers just there,"
replied the doctor, pointing to a group of men a few paces distant.
They came with me to protect me, but I outran them when I saw Edric."
The soldiers soon formed a litter, upon which the M. de Mallet, for the name of the old man, and his daughter were conveyed to the tent of Roderick, where proper surgical aid was afforded them. And whilst they were recovering from the injuries they had received, we will take the opportunity of informing our readers that the circumstances had placed them in so unpleasant a situation. M. de Mallet was a Swiss noble, and upon the usurpation of the despot of Switzerland, he had vehemently defended the liberty of his country. The tyrant had imprisoned him, and he had with difficulty made his escape, followed only by his daughter, who was devotedly attached to him, and who, in all his dangers, had never quitted his side. She had lost her mother in her earliest youth, and since that period all her thoughts and cares had been devoted to her father. To comfort him, he had formed his sole occupation of her life. The self was quite forgotten in her anxiety for his welfare. After escaping from Switzerland, they had taken refuge in Spain, flattering themselves that, as it was a free country, there they should be safe and happy. But alas, they soon found the charms of freedom were more ideal than real, and M. de Mallet, though he had been an enthusiast for liberty under the despotic government of Switzerland, found the sweets of freedom not so great as he had imagined amongst the republicans of Spain, and the pride of the nobles and the conceited ignorance of the insubordination of the people being, as he found by sad experience, things much more agreeable to talk than to endure. In Switzerland he had called the one proud independence, and the other manly daring, but now he discovers nobles and democratic chiefs can be tyrants as well as kings, and that the mob is a many-headed monster most exceedingly difficult to manage. At first, M. de Mallet and his daughter were rapturously received in Spain. No human beings had been more interesting. Plazas filled the air when they appeared, addresses were presented to them from all quarters, and people crowded to see them. The Spanish nobles vied with each other in offering them an asylum. All this was very fine, but unfortunately it was too charming to be lasting. As M. de Mallet and his lovely daughter had seen often, congratulated and condoled with, there was nothing now to be done, and the enthusiasm of the Spaniards began rapidly to abate. In the first moments of triumph, M. de Mallet was blindly believed everything the people had advanced, and had fancied himself, really as they called him, a hero and a martyr. He thus felt sensible to change the feeling they soon envied. He became disgusted with a people so fickle, and being too candid to conceal his sentiments, he suffered the Spaniards to perceive his disgust. The total alienation of the remaining interests they felt for him was the natural consequence. In the heat of enthusiasm, M. de Mallet had accepted freely the offer of a Spanish nobleman to take his house as home, but with the usual tenacity of generous mind in the state of dependence, as soon as he fancied he saw a coldness on the part of his host, he left him instantly and hastened to the house of another, who had been still more warm in his offers of friendship. He, too, soon became cold, and M. de Mallet, like the hare with many friends, though overloaded with professions, found himself completely desolate when he really wanted perfection. M. de Mallet had provided no funds when he left his native country, and his estates having been confiscated, he was thus thrown entirely upon the bounty of strangers. Too high-minded to endure dependence, and too proud to humble himself to labor, M. de Mallet had solicited and obtained promise of a post in the Spanish army, and the directors of the government having promoted him in a place of garrison at Seville, he had proceeded a few weeks before to the house of the Duke of Sidonia, the governor of that city, for the purpose of taking possession. The Duke, however, received him coldly, amusing him with prostrating procrastinating promises, till M. de Mallet found too late he had been duped by the directors, who, to rid themselves of his improprieties, had sentenced Isabel, merely on account to distance him from Madrid, and the difficulty he would have returning to torment him, instead of having any real intention of complying to his wishes. Indignant of the treatment he had met with, M. de Mallet expostulated warmly with the Duke, and the violence of his feelings produced an apoplectic seizure. The Duke, though indifferent to the suit of M. de Mallet, did not destitute the common feelings of humanity he had with him, therefore carried him to a chamber where proper surgical assistance was afforded him. The scene took place in the Duke's country seat, upon the banks of the river, and M. de Mallet had remained there till, aided by a strong constitution and the vigilant attention of his daughter, he was fast recovering. When, however, intelligence being received from the rapid approach of the army of Roderick, the Duke ordered the suburbs to be burnt, including his country house, and unfortunate guests had entirely escaped his recollection. The Spaniards appointed to destroy the suburbs, having performed their task with the utmost barbarity, tearing to pieces and destroying what they could not burn, the servants had flown at their approach, entirely forgetting M. de Mallet and his daughter, who, being a distant quarter of the mansion, knew nothing of what was passing until they were roused to the sense of the situation by flames attacking their apartment. With piercing screams, Pauline succeeded in rousing her father and forcing him from the chamber, but they knew not where to fly. The crackling flames seemed to pursue them wherever they went. The falling timbers threatened every instant to destroy them. At last they reached the hall, and Pauline's beautiful features beamed with the joy of approaching deliverance, when the tottering roof gave way, rocking a few moments in fearful cracking noise, and then falling with a tremendous crash. Pauline saw it coming, and there was not time to escape. Uttering a faint cry, she threw herself before her father, striving to shield him with her delicate body from the coming danger. Feeble, however, would have been provided this slight and fragile barrier to ward off the impending peril, had not fortunately one of the descending rafters stuck between the projecting pillar, thus forming a kind of arch which served to protect them from farther injury. The falling of the roof having also nearly extinguished the fire. Pauline's arm had been broken with the blow, and her shoulder dreadfully lacerated. Yet still the heroic girl supported herself, and sustaining with her remaining arm the apparent lifeless body of her father, who, stunned with so many misfortunes, lay insensible at her feet, she endeavored by her cries to draw the attention of someone on the spot, and as she found her father and herself were so entangled in the ruins that it was impossible they could be extricated without powerful assistance. The keenest interest was excited by Pauline and her father in the breasts of Edric and Roderick, but powerful as it was destined soon to give way to more painful sensations, for scarcely had they been removed to the tent, when Roderick, perceiving the first feeble tints of day streak in the horizon, gave orders for the assault. The city was strongly fortified, and even where the ancient bulwarks were decayed, the governor had hastily supplied their place with food. The city was strongly fortified, and even where the ancient bulwarks had decayed, the governor had hastily supplied their place with wood so skilfully painted to resemble stone, so quite to deceive the eyes of his opponents. 30 towers were ranged at intervals along the formidable-looking walls, and on one side appeared a citadel strongly garrisoned, which commanded the space between the river and the city, where the army of Roderick was now encamped, and which was aided by a kind of ditch which served occasionally as a covered way. The sun now rose in all its splendor, spreading its rich tints of gold and purple over the scene, and sweeping away before it mists of the morning. Soon, however, with its brilliancy to be obscured by the savage rage of man to deface the beauty of nature, soon did roaring cannon and flashing weapons imitate the contempt of the elements, and soon did the gashed and bleeding forms of the assailants strew the ground, rendered slippery by their blood. The besieged defended themselves vigorously. 3 times did Roderick and his soldiers attempt to scale the walls, and 3 times were they repulsed. But at length a breach was made, and Roderick, transported with joy, threw himself into it, shouting to his soldiers to follow him. They obeyed, and the siege would have been at once terminated, but not a cloud of dust, rising in long black columns in the distance, through which the reflection of arms shone dazzling in the sun, given new spirits to the besieged and discouraged the besiegers. Deep masses, half hidden by this heavy cloud and appearing only more vast by the obscurity thrown over them, advanced rapidly, seeming to come on with the mighty force of a raging sea when it rushes along with irresistible force and sweeps before the thing that dare oppose its fury. The garrison of the town, animated at the sight, rallied their half-exhausted forces and drove back the assailants with such carnage that the line of their retreat was long marked with a long stream of blood and expired bodies. Roderick, for the first time in his life, refrained from renewing an attack, for, as he feared being surrounded, he determined to draw off his forces and to give battle to the combined French and Spanish army that was now fast approaching. Can you tell I was getting tired? Ow. Anyway, I did have to pause ads to finish that chapter. So hopefully we can find someone to raid. I think that Herb Griffin is still reading Dracula, if anyone's interested in that. My computer's starting to lag again. Lovely. Herb Griffin should be reading Dracula by now. Again, unless anyone has other suggestions. Let's see. Almost have their bed to look. Yep, they're reading Dracula. Okay. So, there be our messages. And there be our raid queue. So, thank you all for coming in tonight. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And I will hopefully see you tomorrow for some fairy tales. Have a good night.
In the hollow of the night, shadows weave and twist. The wolf has told his stories, wrapped in mystic mist, lurking in the silence where the echoes softly play, the echoes of forgotten tales dimming as they sway. The hours drip like candle wax, slowly melting gold. Lands of frost and twilight, secrets yet untold. The forest breeze a shiver, its ancient heartbeats thrum. Underneath the silver glow, the wild whispers come. Time to close the book.